You know that feeling when you check your bank account and before the app even finishes loading, you already know what you're about to see. You don't really read the number, you just glance long enough to confirm what you were expecting. There's not much there. And the strange part isn't even the balance itself. It's what that balance does to your head. Because when you're close to zero, money's never just money. It's always running in the background, quietly shaping how you think, how you decide, and how far ahead you're even able to plan. It changes the tone of every decision, including the ones that don't look like money decisions on the surface. Every purchase passes through the same mental filter. Can I afford this right now? What if something goes wrong later this week? What happens if I spend this and something unexpected shows up? Most people don't realize how exhausting that loop is because they've been living inside it for so long that it feels normal. This is where people usually misunderstand what's actually happening. They assume this feeling disappears once they earn more, once they get a better job, once they get a raise, once they finally start making real money. But if you've ever met someone who earns decent money and still feels constantly stressed about finances, you already know that's not how it works. More income helps, but it doesn't automatically fix your relationship with money because money problems aren't just numerical, they're psychological. And psychology doesn't magically reset just because a paycheck gets bigger. When people talk about building wealth, they usually jump straight to big numbers: $10,000, six figures, a million. Those numbers sound important. They feel impressive, they feel like success, but almost no one talks about the phase that actually determines whether you'll ever reach those milestones in the first place. The phase between zero and your first real buffer, the $0 to $1,000 phase. This phase isn't glamorous. It doesn't change your lifestyle. Nobody celebrates it. You don't suddenly feel rich. You don't suddenly feel free. And because it feels small and unrewarding, this is where most people quietly give up. Not because they can't do it, but because it doesn't feel like progress. The hardest part of money isn't going from poor to rich. It's going from unstable to stable. That first $1,000 forces you to change how you behave long before the math ever starts helping you. And most people are completely unprepared for how psychologically uncomfortable that is. When you have no savings, your brain operates in what psychologists call scarcity mode. Scarcity mode doesn't just mean you have less money, it means your attention is constantly pulled toward immediate survival, bills, next paycheck, unexpected expenses. Your brain isn't asking, what's the smartest long term move here? It's asking, how do I make sure nothing goes wrong right now? And that difference matters more than people realize because when you're stuck in scarcity mode, long term thinking becomes extremely difficult. Not because you're lazy, not because you're irresponsible, but because your brain is prioritizing short term safety over long term growth. A helpful way to think about this is like trying to think clearly while an alarm is constantly going off in the background. Even if it's not loud, even if you've gotten used to it, it's still there, draining mental energy, pulling your attention, limiting how far ahead you can think. That's what financial stress does. And most people underestimate how much of their mental bandwidth it consumes. This is why the $0 to $1,000 phase feels so uncomfortable. You're trying to build a long term habit while your brain is still wired for short term survival. You're delaying gratification while everything around you is designed to pull money out of your hands as quickly as possible. And at the beginning, there's almost no emotional payoff. Saving $50 doesn't change your life. Saving $100 doesn't change your life. Even saving $500 often doesn't feel meaningfully different day to day. So eventually, your brain asks a very reasonable question: what's the point? This is where people misunderstand discipline. They think the problem is motivation. They tell themselves they need to be more focused, more serious, more committed. But motivation isn't the real issue. The real issue is that a brain under constant financial pressure is not designed to think about growth. It's designed to avoid pain. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Scarcity quietly shapes decisions in the background, even when you're not aware of it. You stay in jobs you dislike longer than you should, not because you lack ambition, but because leaving feels risky. You avoid opportunities that could improve your situation, not because they're bad ideas, but because taking a chance feels irresponsible. You say yes to things you don't want to do because saying no feels unsafe. Stability starts to feel more important than progress. And as long as you're stuck in that loop, wealth building feels abstract and unrealistic, something people talk about online, but not something that feels accessible to you. This is why the $0 to $1,000 phase filters people out. It's not impressive, it doesn't come with applause, and it doesn't provide instant feedback. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But internally, everything is changing. Something subtle but important happens when you finally cross that first $1,000 mark. You don't suddenly feel rich. Your lifestyle doesn't change. Your problems don't magically disappear. But the pressure drops just enough to matter. A small unexpected expense stops feeling catastrophic. A minor setback becomes annoying instead of terrifying. And that reduction in fear creates something incredibly valuable: mental space. When fear isn't consuming all of your attention, your thinking starts to change. You pause before spending instead of reacting automatically. You think one step ahead instead of one step at a time. You start asking better questions. Not just like, can I afford this? But is this actually helping me move forward? That pause is small, but it's the beginning of control, and control is the foundation of everything that comes next. There's another shift happening at this stage that most people don't talk about. You're building proof. You don't accidentally save $1,000. You had to notice where your money was going. You had to delay purchases. You had to resist impulse spending. And you had to do it consistently, even when it felt boring and unrewarding. That process changes how you see yourself. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who just spends whatever comes in. You start seeing yourself as someone who can hold on to money. That identity shift matters more than the number itself, because people who believe they can control their money behave very differently from people who don't. Once you cross that first threshold, the conversation around money starts to change. Not dramatically, but enough that you notice it. You're no longer constantly bracing for impact. You're no longer operating as if every small problem could turn into an emergency. That small buffer gives you something most people underestimate: options. Options don't mean luxury, they mean choice. They mean the ability to respond instead of react. When you have no savings, decisions feel forced. You take the option that feels safest in the short term, even if it hurts you long term. But once you have even a little margin, your brain starts operating differently. You're no longer asking, what's the safest move? You start asking, what's the smartest move? This is also where people misunderstand compounding. They think compounding is purely mathematical: money growing on money, interest on interest. And yes, that matters. But the real compounding starts earlier. It starts with behavior. Once you've built the habit that gets you to $1,000, that habit doesn't disappear. Your behavior stays consistent. And because the behavior stays consistent, the math finally gets a chance to work. This is why people who skip this phase often struggle later. They try to jump straight into investing. They chase strategies, they optimize spreadsheets, but they never built emotional stability around money. So when markets dip, they panic. When volatility shows up, they react. Not because the strategy is bad, but because the foundation is fragile. The $0 to $1,000 phase teaches patience. It teaches restraint. It teaches you how it feels to wait without panicking. If you skip that lesson, you usually relearn it later, with more money on the line. Let's make this more concrete, because this is where the real difference between people starts to show up. Imagine two people earning roughly the same income, same salary, same city, same cost of living. On paper, their situations look almost identical. But over time, their financial trajectories end up completely different. The difference isn't intelligence, it isn't discipline, and it isn't how hard they work. It's whether or not they've crossed that first stability threshold. The first person lives close to zero, not because they're irresponsible, but because their money always has somewhere else to go. Every unexpected expense feels like a crisis. Every month feels tight. Every decision feels reactive. They think in terms of monthly payments instead of total cost. They choose convenience over leverage. They avoid risks that could actually improve their situation because risk feels dangerous when there's no margin. The second person isn't wealthy. They don't have a massive portfolio, but they've crossed that first $1,000 mark. They have a small buffer, nothing impressive, just enough margin to breathe. Now watch how their decisions slowly start to diverge. When a problem shows up, the first person panics. The second person problem solves. When an opportunity appears, the first person focuses on what could go wrong. The second person thinks about potential upside. When a career opportunity presents itself, the first person thinks, I can't afford to take that risk. The second person thinks, is this worth the risk? Same income, same intelligence, different foundations. And over time, that difference compounds. Not because one person is smarter, but because one person has mental space. This is what people really mean when they say money creates options. It's not about buying more stuff. It's about being able to think clearly. Once you're out of survival mode, you stop micromanaging small expenses and start paying attention to big decisions. When you're broke, every dollar feels enormous. You debate every purchase. Should I buy the name brand cereal or the generic version? Is it worth spending $3 on coffee? Should I get regular gas or premium? These decisions consume mental energy because every dollar feels precious. But when you have a small financial foundation, those micro decisions lose their emotional weight. They still matter, but they're no longer the main event. Instead, your attention shifts to bigger questions: where you live, what you drive, how much you save, where you invest. These decisions have an outsized impact on your long term financial outcome. The difference between buying coffee and making it at home might add up to a few $100s a year. The difference between a reasonable housing choice and an inflated one can swing your net worth by tens of thousands over time. When you're no longer in survival mode, you finally have the mental bandwidth to focus on the decisions that actually move the needle. This shift is incredibly liberating, not because you stop caring about money, but because you stop wasting energy on things that don't matter as much. You're no longer micromanaging every dollar out of fear. You're making intentional decisions based on priorities, and that's a completely different relationship with money. This is also where compounding starts to become visible. At first, the math feels almost insulting. A small return on a small amount of money doesn't feel meaningful, but as your balance grows, the ratio starts to change. You're no longer doing all the work. Your money begins doing some of the work for you. At first, it's subtle, then it's noticeable, and eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. But none of that happens if you never build the foundation. This is why people who try to skip this phase often feel frustrated later. They're doing the right things on paper, but emotionally, they're not equipped to stay consistent when things get uncomfortable. Markets fluctuate, returns aren't linear, periods of boredom and uncertainty are normal. Without a solid foundation, those periods feel like failure. With a foundation, they feel like part of the process. This is the difference between people who stick with a plan and people who abandon it. Not because one group is more disciplined, but because one group feels safe enough to stay patient. One of the most dangerous moments in someone's financial life happens right after they hit their first real milestone. Not before, after. Because this is the moment where many people undo months, sometimes years, of progress. They finally build a small buffer. They finally feel that psychological relief. And then they immediately treat it like a reward. They tell themselves they deserve something: a nicer car, a big vacation, an upgrade they've been delaying. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. They worked hard. They sacrificed. They stayed disciplined. But here's the mistake: that first financial buffer isn't a reward, it's infrastructure. It's the foundation everything else is built on. When you spend it casually, you're not just spending money, you're removing stability, you're turning down the volume on the very thing that gave you clarity, confidence, and control in the first place. And suddenly, you're back in reaction mode, stressed, tight, mentally constrained. This is one of the main reasons people feel like they're running in place financially. They keep rebuilding the same small foundation over and over again instead of letting it grow into something meaningful. This is also where opportunity cost becomes real. Before you had savings, opportunity cost was theoretical. It was something people talked about online. But once you've built a buffer, it becomes personal. Every major purchase forces a new kind of question. Not just, can I afford this, but what am I giving up by choosing this? Cars are the clearest example. Most people don't think of a car as a wealth decision. They think of it as transportation. But when you add it up over time, payments, insurance, maintenance, fuel, it becomes one of the largest expenses in the average person's life, hundreds of dollars a month, for decades. And yet, many of the same people feel like saving or investing is impossible. Here's the uncomfortable reality: the average person will spend more money on cars over their lifetime than it would take to build real financial independence. And that's before you even account for depreciation. The moment a new car leaves the lot, it loses a significant portion of its value. So you're not just spending money, you're actively destroying it. Compare that to investing the same amount. Instead of watching your money disappear, you're watching it compound. Instead of trading future freedom for present convenience, you're doing the opposite. This is where the mindset shift becomes obvious. The person with a solid financial foundation stops asking, does this make me look successful? And starts asking, does this move me closer to freedom? This doesn't mean you never buy nice things. It means you understand the trade off. That car payment might make you feel successful, but it might also be delaying your financial independence by years. Once you see that clearly, the decision feels different. Driving a reliable used car no longer feels like a sacrifice. It feels like a strategic choice. This mindset shift doesn't stop with cars. It extends to housing, education, vacations, hobbies. Everything starts passing through the same filter. Is this actually improving my life long term, or is it quietly consuming resources? What surprises most people is what happens next. Once you start thinking this way, you often realize you don't actually want half the things you thought you wanted. That bigger apartment might be nice, but is it worth delaying your freedom by 5 years? That expensive hobby might be fun, but are there cheaper ways to get the same satisfaction? This isn't about becoming cheap, it's about becoming intentional. And intentionality is what separates people who build wealth from people who don't. There's another shift that happens once you're past that first stability phase. Your relationship with work changes when you're living paycheck to paycheck. Your job controls you more than you realize. You might not consciously think about it this way, but your negotiating position is incredibly weak. You can't push back on unreasonable demands. You can't comfortably ask for a raise. You can't explore better opportunities without fear. Because losing that paycheck doesn't feel inconvenient, it feels catastrophic, even if you hate the job. Even if it's clearly holding you back, fear keeps you stuck. A small financial buffer changes that dynamic, not because you suddenly become reckless, but because you're no longer desperate. And desperation shapes behavior in ways most people underestimate. When you know you could survive for a few months without everything falling apart, you show up differently. You speak differently, you negotiate differently, you take calculated risks instead of avoiding them entirely. This is what people mean when they talk about walking away money, not because you plan to quit, but because knowing you could gives you leverage. Most of the time, you never even need to use it. Just having that leverage changes how you operate. You're calmer, more confident, more assertive, and people notice. Often, this leads to better assignments, more responsibility, more recognition, and yes, more income. It becomes a positive feedback loop. Confidence creates opportunity, opportunity creates growth, growth creates options. But here's the part most people never stop to think about. There's rarely a single dramatic moment where you suddenly feel financially different, no clear before and after, no line you cross where everything changes overnight. Instead, it happens quietly. One day, an unexpected expense shows up, and you don't panic. Another day, you say no, and it doesn't stress you out. Another day, you wait instead of reacting. Individually, those moments don't feel important, but together they signal a fundamental shift. You're no longer operating from fear, you're operating from control. And that's what this entire phase is really about. Not the number itself, but the behavior it forces you to develop: patience, restraint, the ability to delay gratification even when it's uncomfortable. That skill doesn't just apply to money, it transfers everywhere: health, career, learning, relationships. People who master this phase tend to do better in all of them, not because they're special, but because they've learned how to think long term. That's why the $0 to $1,000 phase quietly determines who builds momentum and who stays stuck. It's not impressive, it doesn't make flashy screenshots, it doesn't look like success from the outside, but it shapes everything that comes after. So if you're at zero right now or close to it, don't underestimate where you are. You're not behind. You're standing at the most important starting line. This is the phase that teaches you how the game actually works. Everything else builds on top of it. Your first $1,000 won't change your lifestyle, but it will change how you think. And once your thinking changes, your behavior follows. And once your behavior changes, time finally starts working in your favor. That's where real progress begins, not with a big number, but with the first one that forces you to change.